Okay, folks, we're outside in the garage and it's time to we're gonna sit and whittle us a little gnome, okay? It just cut me out a little gnome. I drew it out in a little shape, in other words, and got the hat and everything like that. And we're just kind of sitting here and enjoying this day. We've had a lot of rain down here in Texas, and let me get my pencil. As my dad used to say, my pencil. And we're gonna do us a little gnome here and talk, discuss some things. And we had a good little talk in the last one about wood carving. We're gonna talk a little bit more about that. And I've got a little bit different situation right now at my house. My brother-in-law is living with me, and I won't go into the details of why he's here. He's 70-something years old also, but he's going to be with me until he can get him an apartment. He's going to move back down here. And well, I'm not going to get into it because it's like a Peyton place. Believe it or not, at his age, you know, he's got a Peyton place in his life right now, in his marriage. And now those of you that don't know what Peyton Place is, that maybe you're too young, I mean, most of you probably know. It was a movie or a show. Actually, it was a movie, it was a show, but it was also it was one of these big drama type things. In other words, like soap operas. That's the name for it, soap operas. And it was a real dramatic, like these soap operas they have today. We call them soap operas. Now they call them stories and all that other stuff. So a lot of drama, you know, and all that stuff. Anyway, here's my nose here, so I'm gonna cut that out right now. And a lot of you, some of you may not be familiar with the soap operas, as we say. Oh my goodness, my grandmother wouldn't miss a soap opera. And years and years ago, when I was a kid, they had soap operas all day long. During the day, that's what you watched. We only had 3 stations, and they had the soap operas. And basically, what they were stories of people, and they were dramatic stories, and they were you know, Hollywood, but they were dramatic stories about people having all kind of issues in their lives. And my grandmother watched them things like, I mean, they were just to her. By the way, this is 4 inches by 1.5. Okay, that's what it is. It's 4 inches tall by 1.5. So that's the thing. But those older women loved those soap operas. They just absolutely loved them. And they thought that was the greatest things in the world, you know, greater than peanut butter. And they wouldn't miss those things. They would sit there all day long, and they had those things one after another. Usually in the morning, they would have some things for small children that were still at home, and like Sesame Street or something. Of course, Sesame Street wasn't back when I was a young man. And then the soap operas would start around 11:30, and they would go just about 4 hours or more into the afternoon. And because they knew that the women would be watching during that time who had kids, because women didn't work as much back then, and like grandmothers too. And so they were real popular. They had such things as Days of Our Life, and let's see, As the World Turns, and I know we laugh about that stuff now, but it's you know, it's no different than when they started coming out with shows like Dallas and things like that. They were just basically soap operas. They were dramatic portrayals of people whose lives were messed up and stuff like that. But they were very popular. and because women stayed at home and took care of the kids, so they had to provide something. Then late in the afternoons, well, late in the afternoons, then they had where the kids would come home in the afternoons. Then they would have, they would have the things for the kids in the afternoons, so to watch, like Dark Shadows and things like that. So they pretty much knew how to. I'm cutting the beard right now out just a little bit. This is not a real difficult situation here. We do this, and so that was what went on. People watched a lot of TV back then because there really wasn't anything else. They didn't have the video games. They didn't have they just didn't have all the activity going on. Kids would come home from school and they'd have to do homework, and they'd have a little time to watch their favorite programs. And after school, we used to call them after school programs, and so that was something that we would do. And my grandmother just absolutely ate those things up. She just loved those soap operas, and she'd often talk about them, that so-and-so, and she'd talk about them like they were real people. Because I think down deep, some of those people actually believed that they were real people. Not that they didn't know it wasn't TV, but they actually became so involved in the stories that they actually believed that it was, there were actually real people in the stories that were, instead of just fiction, as we might say. So that was a very unique type deal there. And so they loved that. And there was several things. Those of you that are listening to me, if you've been around a while, you remember your grandmother and them watching those type of things, and there were particular shows that those ladies loved. And one of the things that my grandmother loved was, especially on Sunday afternoon, an old boy named Lawrence Welk. And Lawrence Welk was a band member, and he would have a show, and my grandmother just loved it. And now, a lot of people, now what you have today, the WWE, which is the World Wrestling Federation, or whatever it is, or WWF, a lot of that started from small wrestlers of long ago. And a lot of local towns had their own wrestling stations and stuff like that. And my grandmother loved wrestling. She just absolutely loved to watch and back then it wasn't just, now it's just, it's really, it costs probably hundreds and thousands of dollars or millions of dollars to stage some of these things. It's just all, fluff and flight. But back then, they just wrestled in a ring that was maybe in a studio audience or studio or whatever, and had an audience. And she would watch wrestling every Saturday. She absolutely loved it. So, and she got deeply involved with these characters, and she thought basically these people were real. So, I don't know if people get that involved with it anymore, but she did. And basically there was no fluff to it. There was no big, fireworks and stuff like that. It was just people getting in there and wrestling and hitting each other over the head with a chair every once in a while and stuff like that. And that was she absolutely lost over all that stuff. She loved it. She loved wrestling. So I didn't even think I was going to not even talk about anything like this, but I thought about her, and I thought, well, just sort of brought it up. I guess I was talking about my brother-in-law, but she loved those soap operas, and she became deeply involved in them. So that was her entertainment, and it was funny to watch her. She just would talk about these people like they were real. Like they actually existed, in other words. And she would call them by name, and she would talk about them to my grandfather. And my grandfather thought, who in the world is that? We don't know those people. But that's what it was. They were actually soap opera stars. And then he finally, we began to tell Grandpa, that's these people. That's these people that are on there. And so these people were very real to my grandmother. And you have to understand, at a time like that, people back then, they didn't have 24-hour news and all that stuff. So we were not real familiar. Whatever happened outside of whatever happened outside of, I'm going to be cutting the arms in right now. Whatever happened outside people didn't know. We didn't have 24-hour news. We didn't have those things. In fact, the news that we did have was only around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We had a local news, and then we had and I know it's hard for a lot of you to understand it. We only had 3 stations. We had 4, 6, and 12. That was NBC, CBS, and ABC, and that's all we had. 3 stations. Now you got 300 stations or more, 3,000. Some cases, in other words. So people have a lot to choose from. But that's the only place people got their news, was locally and through those things. So a lot of us just did not have access. So my grandmother, when she would see these people on TV, she would actually believe almost that these were real people. And I guess you could call people dumb back then, and I don't think they were necessarily dumb. In fact, they were pretty smart people. But they just did not, they didn't have access to the outside world. Now, I'm going to tell you something that a lot of people cannot believe back then, and that is the fact that a lot of those people that I knew and I grew up with, relatives and stuff, they lived in certain parts of the country. For instance, in Texas or southeast Texas where we lived, and some of those people, believe it or not, they never left that area. What I'm saying is, I don't mean moving. I'm talking about the fact they never went anywhere else but within a certain radius. It's not like long trips. People didn't take a lot of long trips back then in certain areas. There are people in small towns that have never left those small towns. They've never even left those small towns. They have lived in those towns. They've never taken vacation out of those towns. And so people just didn't travel. They didn't have the money. They didn't have those things. So because they didn't travel, they didn't know about what was going on in other areas and what was going on. And they didn't have the internet that could tell them how it was doing. So we just didn't have that. In fact, I never really went to traveling hardly at all. I mean, we traveled up to some friends' camps and stuff, but as a young boy, I never went outside of where I lived. And my mother and daddy didn't either, although they went to Michigan one time to see some friends who lived in Michigan. But as far as traveling and stuff, we just didn't do it. Because first of all, we didn't have the money. And second of all, now we had to travel sometimes for hurricanes, to get away from hurricanes and stuff like that. But people don't I mean, the amount of people traveling today is astronomical compared to how people traveled back then. They just did not travel long distances and go on vacations like they didn't. I mean, in our area they didn't. Maybe elsewhere they did. But in our area, no. They didn't travel. So a lot of people never left their whole life, lived in their area, and never left and went outside anywhere to go anywhere. So they weren't familiar with really what was going on, but what was in their little communities and their places. And whatever news was fed to us, now we had a national news, but whatever news was fed to us, I mean, it was mostly local, and we would keep within that local place. And I mean, you know, you don't call, you know, you couldn't turn on CNN or Fox News or something like that and get worldwide news. You just didn't do it. And you know, usually if something happened now, within a few minutes, the news media is already there and they're televising it and all that other stuff. So and so happened. Well, that wasn't the way we lived back then. In fact, if it happened early that morning, it didn't get really shown to us until 5:30 that afternoon or whatever. We just didn't, they just didn't, you know, follow the news that much and all that other stuff. So it was a different time, a totally different time. And those of you that, you know, that are maybe listening to me and live that, you know what I'm talking about. You understand that. And then you say, well, what does it matter? Well, it matters because that's how much things have changed. Now, I'm 70 years old, okay? But 70 years is not a long time. It's really not a long time compared to how much has taken place in those 70 years. And we were talking about that with wood carving, and see as it goes into it. So much has changed in wood carving. So much has changed that, like when I started my videos in 2007, nobody had hardly any videos, hardly had them at all. But now everybody, you know, if you've got a camera, you can, you know, you can do videos. And mine were not all that good. I have to admit, most of my earlier videos, and maybe even today, they ain't all that great. But now with good cameras and technology and stuff, people are really doing a great job of it. So things have changed immensely. And when I was a kid, now just think, when I was a kid, which I'm 70 now, and a lot of people think 70 years is a long time. It's not. Really, it's not. It's not a long time when you think about it. Now, maybe to you it's a long time, but in most cases, 70 years is not a long time. So, and I'm just making my arms back here. Just kind of making those. Here as we go. It's not a long time when you really look at it. For technology and for medicine and things to come that quickly. So we today are spoiled by the fact that when anything happens, we already know it within a very short period of time. But it wasn't that way. It was like when Vietnam War was going on, and I'm sure they heavily censored a lot of things, but you know, unless you were listening to the national news at 5:30 every day, you would have the local news at 5 o'clock and then the national news at 5:30. You really didn't know all that much about what was going on. And we just didn't. Heck, now you can go on that, what's that channel, C-SPAN or whatever it is. You can listen to the politicians talking and giving speeches and talking about bills and stuff like that. We never had anything like that. So let's just put it this way. Basically, we were kind of intellectually and technologically ignorant when it came down to it. And so my grandmother and other people, they basically believed in, and wrestling was a joke then. But it was more realistic than what it is today. You know, they hit each other with chairs and stuff, and it became real to people. And that was their enjoyment, and that was their entertainment, and that was their thing. So people lived in there. There you go. See, we got our little gnome looking good. People basically lived in their own little world. We're going to come up here and work on the hat a little bit now. And so it was different. It was totally different. It was a different time. It was a different place. And just like everything else. And when a lot of people don't grasp or understand why it is so just amazing to people like myself and others who lived at that time to see the technology and how quick it has gone. And that's the thing that is so, unique about all of this stuff. And how technology has grown, and how communication is different, and all those things. So people that lived during that time lived in a time that was unusual to us. So we believed a lot of things that were told to us. We had a man named Walter Cronkite who did the evening news, who just basically as I've told you, we've changed our format now since everybody is teaching stuff. This is just let's sit and whittle a gnome, and talk, and like we're sitting here talking to one another, whittling, and get your favorite whittling piece, and we'll sit and talk. But we had a man named Walter Cronkite who was on the national news. And let me tell you something. If Walter Cronkite would have said the moon was made of cheese, people would have believed him. He was that, he had that much influence on people. They loved him. They loved Walter Cronkite. And I'm not saying he was a liar or anything like that. I'm just saying he had a following because basically we were, what we heard on the news, we thought was true. We didn't think